Hey guys, welcome to Lecture 7, first one in the evolution unit, number 7 overall. Today we'll be talking about taxonomy, transitional forms, and coevolution. Our objective, what you should be able to do after viewing and listening to this lecture, is describe taxonomy, transitional forms, and coevolution in order to explain how new species evolve. Okay, we'll start with transitional forms. Transitional forms are fossils or organisms that show intermediate states between an ancestral form and a modern form of the organism. Right? Intermediate meaning an in-between state, an ancestral form meaning the oldest, and a modern form meaning the youngest. So down here in this graphic, we have the oldest on the left, increasing in modernity over here to this guy who's the most modern on the right. That means that these two guys in the middle are transitional forms. We know that they're transitional forms because this guy and this guy, actually all of them, they all have these tentacles, they all have a shell, they all have similar characteristics that show us that they're actually the same animal. Okay. Another example is whale evolution. Right? Over here on the left, again, is the oldest. This is the ancestral form. On the right is the modern form. The ancestral form 50 million years ago. The whales had their nostrils right at the front of their skull, similar to humans. The nostril of a whale, we know, is a blowhole, which if you think of a whale coming up to the surface, you only see the top of it. Right? But back in the day, 50 million years ago, they had to stick their whole mouth out of the water so they could breathe. Then, 25 million years ago, we see that the nostrils are in the middle of the skull. Right? So they didn't have to stick their whole mouth out of the water, just a little bit of it so they could breathe. Today, the gray whale, the blowhole, the nostril, is at the very top of their head. So they didn't even have to bring their mouth outside the water. They can pretty much just stay underwater submerged, and a tiny little bit of them has to breach the surface of the water. All right, another example is this cartoon, Homer Sapien. This is a cartoon of Homer Simpson. All right, and the way he started, over here to the left, over here is Monkeus etylatus, eventually evolved to Chimpus imbecilis, then to Apis stupidus, then Neanderslav, and finally to his self, Homer sapien. We can see that he shares many characteristics, the modern form shares many characteristics with his ancestral form, as well as these three transitional forms. Okay, next up is coevolution, which is the process by which two completely unrelated species evolve in responses to changes in each other. Okay, for example, we'll give poisonous newts, kind of like salamanders, and garter snakes. First, newts started out with a poison that the snake wouldn't eat them. Okay, so if the snake ate them, the snake would die. As a result, eventually the snakes evolved an anti-poison, an anti-venom, so that the newts wouldn't hurt them when they ate them. Then the newts decided to say, hey, we don't want to be eaten, so they evolved a more toxic poison, which causes snakes then to evolve a more effective anti-venom, and so on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, we'll change ideas here and go to endosymbiotic theory. Okay, this theory describes how eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei, evolve from prokaryotic cells. Very, very simple bacteria cells that don't have nucleus. Okay? Endosymbiotic theory says that mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, and chloroplasts, the part in the plant cell that does photosynthesis, were once inside their own cells, or once their own cells, not inside any cell, they were their own cell. And then they were taken inside of other early cells. So basically, a mitochondria one day was floating around doing its thing, and another cell came and ate it. And that's how we think we got eukaryotic cells. Okay, there are several pieces of evidence for endosymbiotic theory. Mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA, which is similar to that of bacteria. They have two membranes surrounding them. They reproduce through binary fission, just like bacteria, and they're similar in size and shape compared to bacteria. All right, let's move on to taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of describing, classifying, and naming living things. I have those things highlighted in red because they're the three most important things that happen in taxonomy. They describe, classify, and name. Okay? In order to classify and name and also describe, we have 8 levels of classification. Right? Scientists use shared characteristics, or things that organisms have in common, to classify living things into an 8-level system. The more characteristics animals have in common, the more levels they will share. Okay? So these classification levels, in order from most general all the way down to most specific. We have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay? The most specific being domain. It's the broadest and it has the greatest number of organisms. The least specific, the broadest is domain. The broadest category is domain. The most specific is species. Okay, there's only one organism per species name. Let's do an example. All right, I've even put this in a funnel, right? Because everything that goes through the funnel eventually gets more and more close together and specific and streamlined. All right, so we'll start at the top of the funnel, almost outside of it, at domain. The example is eukarya. This is the domain of eukaryotes, all organisms that have cells with nuclei. Get a little more specific to kingdom. All right, our example here is Animalia. So we're in the animal kingdom. Next we go to phylum. So our example is Chordata. The chord in the word chordata means to have a spinal cord. So all animals in the phylum Chordata have a spinal cord. Next we'll move to class, the example being Mammalia. So now we're talking about mammals, getting even more specific. Next is the order, example Carnivora, all mammals that are carnivores. Next, family, example being Felidae, which Felidae reminds me of the word feline, so I think we might be getting down to a cat. Genus, example Felis, all right, so we're probably going to be down to a cat. And look at that. This species, Felis domesticus, the common house cat. Okay. When we get to the species level, everything is assigned a 2-part scientific name. The first part is always the genus name, and the second is the species name. More than one organism can have the same genus name, remember, because that's not the most specific level of classification. But only one organism, one kind of organism, can have the same species name. This genus and species are usually written in Latin or Greek. So, we're going to need to remember the order of the levels. So we're going to use a mnemonic device. Okay, we're going to use deer, D for domain. King, K for kingdom. Philip, P for phylum. Cried, C for class. Over, O for order. Funky, F for family. Green, G for genus. And shoes, S for species. Deer, King, Philip, cried, over, funky, green, shoes. And that's it. Go ahead and take the quiz, and I will see you in class.